Okay, so hello and welcome back, and today we'll be talking about the Sunset Limited, which was the Southern Pacific's premier transcontinental train that ran from Los Angeles to New Orleans. And I know a quick note on that is technically SP trains ran the other way in their designations, as in they ran east to west or anywhere in the direction of not San Francisco to San Francisco. And since I'm more used to the Amtrak way of designating this, I am going to be talking about it as in it going from LA to New Orleans instead of New Orleans to LA. But anyways, we'll just move on from that. This is I guess, not really the last one in the series of transcontinental routes, but near the last. And it ran Los Angeles to New Orleans instead of to Chicago. This line was built to maintain the Central Pacific's, at least at this point when the railway was created, monopoly on shipping goods and people to and from California. This was done through the Southern Pacific, which at this point was still a subsidiary, which through legal wrangling became the dominant part of this conglomeration, which eventually led to the end of the Central Pacific as a brand and or entity. So in 1870, just months after the completion of the connection to the Union Pacific at Promontory Point, Utah, the Big Four of the Central Pacific conceived a plan to further entrench the company as the Railway of California. To do this, they wanted to make sure that they would control the second of the planned transcontinental routes to California, and by 1777, God, I can English. By 1877, the Southern Pacific, Central Pacific controlled about 80% or so of the railroad mileage in California, and they had started expanding eastward to make sure no other railway could challenge them. In 1881, they succeeded by connecting to the Santa Fe at Deming, New Mexico, thus completing the second transcontinental route between the East Coast, or at least Midwest, and the West Coast. But they didn't want to stop there. They kept pushing on further east and eventually met up in El Paso with, I believe it was the Texas and Pacific, because they were trying to also push west, so they made sure to connect with them in El Paso, as well as with other smaller railroads, most notably the Texas and New Orleans, to make sure that they couldn't go further east. And brief history on them. Between 1881 and 1883, the SP actually did buy out a bunch of smaller railways across Texas and Louisiana. The prominent acquisitions include the Harrisburg Railroad from Houston to San Antonio, and eventually it went on to El Paso, and the Texas and New Orleans, which connected Houston to New Orleans, as well as Dallas and Galveston Bay. Texas and God, again, I can English. Texas and New Orleans and the Harrisburg line were all built before the Civil War, at least in part, and were greatly expanded beforehand. And in the years of the Civil War, these railways fell on hard times, or at least post-Civil War, and the T&O actually also had to change from a 5-foot gauge to standard gauge, which is narrower. By this time, though, they didn't have a healthy network. They did have a healthy network extending across East Texas and Louisiana. This is the T&O, and they may or may not have bought out the Harrisburg line. Can't really tell if the T&O bought them before the T&O was bought by the SP. I can't really tell. And since I'm not really focusing too much on the internal history of the T&O, I'm not really gonna dig too far into it, and they might get their own video in the future, but again, as of yet, it's not planned. And then the T&O was formerly merged into the Southern Pacific in 1961, but in its time it went from being a regional railroad to part of a transcontinental rail network, even though it was technically owned by a much larger conglomerate from California. But again, that's kind of how railroad history worked. After the Sunset route was formally opened in 1888, the Sunset Limited started running in 1894. This train ran as an all-Pullman train from New Orleans to Louisiana, with through cars, and I think it was actually the entire train all the way to San Francisco. This route was a route of trade-offs, much like the Golden State is and was, and we'll get into that in its own video. It also had some significant upsides compared to it. The Sunset route was an all-weather route, unlike the other transcontinental railroads, which had to cross major mountains. Again, this had no major mountain crossings. The downside was that it wasn't a very scenic route, unlike the other ones. But in the late 1800s, this meant fewer delays and generally a much faster trip from one side of the country to the other. Despite this being the one train that the SP controlled from coast to quote-unquote coast, it was still a very subdued train compared to the Chiefs and the City fleet. The SP actually didn't upgrade this train to streamline equipment until 1950, which was more than 15 years after the City trains and the Chiefs had started running and were upgraded to streamlined trains. But the Sunset Limited was expanded over the years, despite it being one of the last trains to be streamlined on the SP system, and actually it was one of the last to be streamlined and dieselized in the whole country. It started out as a standard train with standard sleepers, which meant mostly sections with some enclosed compartments and drawing rooms. It also had a baggage car that at first contained a barber and smoking lounge and a dining car. By the 1920s, the train had received its first observation car, and the baggage car had a barber shop, and the smoking lounge was swapped out for a library, which basically just carried magazines and a few books. It wasn't really that big of a deal. It was just a place to read. Just before the Second World War, the train was assigned a railway post office, which was weird considering about half the trains at this point basically carried mail, and a new lounge with a barbershop and shower was added, which was incredibly rare for trains at this time because basically no trains had showers. And as far as I can tell, only maybe a couple trains actually had showers at any point during the pre-Amtrak days, so weird thing to note. And a proper coffee shop was added, but this was done a few years after the launch of the Coast Daylight, the Lark, and the City Fleet, so it was highly unusual that the SP actually held off upgrading what was their premier and only transcontinental train that was kind of like the Santa Fe all the way. It was SP all the way from one end to the other, even though it was technically switched off to a subsidiary in El Paso. But after it was streamlined, this train came into its own and was the equal of trains such as the Lark and the Cascade. As mentioned previously, the Sunset Limited was streamlined in 1950 and was one of the last trains in the SP system to be streamlined, as also mentioned, it was one of the last to be streamlined in the US, at least out of all the trains that were. And the SP spared no expense to upgrade this train when they streamlined it, which was kind of a contrast with the Golden State, which they actually pulled out of. But again, we'll get into that in its own video. The SP bought 70 stainless steel cars from Bud, which were divided into 5 different train sets. Each one consisted of a 48-seat coach with a partition due to Jim Crow laws east of El Paso, 3 44-seat coaches, and 6 10-6 sleepers, and 3 non-revenue cars. But before we get into that, a 10-6 sleeper is basically 10 roomette sleeper with 10 individual rooms for one person, and 6 double bedrooms for 2 people, or maybe a family of 3 people. This train was unusual in the fact that it didn't really carry any other sleeping car types, because normally trains would have at least one car that would have compartments in the Streamline era sense and drawing rooms in the Streamline era sense, which were significantly larger. Of the 3 non-revenue cars, there was the Audubon dining room, which had bird paintings in the cars, the Pride of Texas coffee shop, which had branded leather walls, and the French Quarter lounge, which had watermelon red painting and wrought iron decorations. These 3 cars rivaled the triple section diners that graced the Daylights, the Lark, and the Cascade. And the post-war triple section diners, as I mentioned in those videos, actually had kitchen and crew dorms, along with the dining room area and a lounge. At least that's what the Lark and the Cascade had. The only thing that set these trains apart was the lack of, compared to the other first class trains, was a rounded end observation car, which kind of also contributed to the notion that this route wasn't very scenic, despite it having a relatively fast 42-hour schedule between LA and New Orleans. At the height of the Sunset route's passenger service, at least on the whole, the train had through cars that ran to Jacksonville and Washington. This enabled people to make a coast-to-coast trip without having to go through Chicago, which according to some was a big success for a very short period of time. The railroads, as mentioned in other installments on this channel, had through cars running from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. Not only did the Sunset have through cars and after it was streamlined, but it also had a secondary train that ran along the same route as the Sunset Limited, and this was the Argonaut. The Argonaut was not a very fancy train by any stretch of the words, and it started running in 1926 and stopped running in 1963. This train, like many other trains in the SP system, like the Owl, the West Coast Limited, and the Klamath, were never streamlined, and it ran as heavyweight cars from the time it started to the time they stopped running, usually in the 50s and 60s. This was a tradition of most railroads, giving the cars that they didn't want, or the trains that they didn't want, the cars that they that they wanted to get rid of. And since they would have the worst equipment possible, usually these cars were scrapped the day after the trains were dropped. And the Argonaut was also, at least at its height, was the far cheaper option to the Sunset Limited, and was there to attract the more budget-minded travelers, as well as haul a bunch of mail cars. And also this train had a connection over an SP short line to San Diego, which actually dipped through Mexico for a little bit. Just a little fun little point about the railway. According to sources, some of the more famous things the Argonaut did was carry landing gear, or at least a boxcar full of landing gear for planes during World War II, so it would arrive on time at the factory, I think in Southern California. And one time it even stopped for fresh goat's milk for a baby. And there were also a few notable crashes. One happened in 1938 when it rear-ended the Californian, and the other one in 1951 when it derailed outside the town of Small, Texas, while it was carrying troops to the Korean War, or at least, I guess, to Long Beach or wherever to get on the ship to go to Korea. And in 1958, this train was shortened to a Houston-New Orleans train only, when it was ultimately canceled 5 years later, which is about 5 years before the end of the mail contracts. So the client hit the Sunset route hard. Not only did it lose its secondary train, as I said, about 5 years before all the mail contracts ended, but it was cut hard like all the other SP trains. By the late 1960s, the train was basically finished as far as the SP was concerned. For a brief time, it even ran as an all-coach train, with only a coffee shop for food service. After the ICC intervened, it was restored to having sleepers, lounges, and full dining, but the train was reduced to a 3-time-a-week schedule, or tri-weekly, and it used to run on a daily schedule. In 1970, just before Amtrak took over, the train was in probably its sorriest state, and it was running again as an all-coach train on its 3-time-a-week schedule with the much-dreaded Automat car, which hopefully I'll throw in a picture of here, which was a car where you essentially bought food out of vending machines, and you self-served and ate yourself. And these things were probably one of the most hated features of the Southern Pacific in its last few years of running passenger trains. And in 1971, when Amtrak was created, it did choose to retain the Sunset Limited. This makes the Sunset Limited, at least at the time of writing, the oldest continually operated passenger train in the United States. And as far as I can tell, the Sunset Limited has always run on a tri-weekly schedule in the Amtrak era. I have heard some rumors that it did run as a daily train sometime in the 80s and up into the mid-90s, maybe, and then was reduced to tri-weekly in the mid-90s. But I can't confirm this since I don't have access to all of Amtrak's system schedules for all of its existence. So I've heard that it might have run as a daily train at some point in Amtrak's existence and then was downgraded again, but I can't really confirm that. If someone watching this at some point can, please do, but I personally cannot. So Amtrak did try and succeed to extend the Sunset Limited east of Florida and restore service over the old Louisville and Nashville's Gulf Coast Limited route between New Orleans and Jacksonville. The Sunset Limited was extended to various points in Florida over the years, including Miami, Orlando, and Sanford, which is where the auto train currently terminates. This arrangement of running service into Florida continued until Hurricane Katrina wrecked the tracks, and Amtrak, as per usual, lacked the funds and the equipment to restart the service. And prior to the Florida segment getting cut, the Sunset Limited actually ran on 24 hours late during this time because it had to go all the way to Florida to get service and turned around, and it was just a pain. So even if Amtrak wanted to restore the service, probably wouldn't run as a continuation of the Sunset Limited again because that didn't really work out so well. And there were some incidents involving the Sunset Limited during the Amtrak era. One of Amtrak's worst crashes in its history actually involved the Sunset Limited, which was the Big Bayou crash, which happened on September 22nd, 1993, which a barge ran into a bridge in the fog, and it moved the bridge out of place, and for some reason didn't trip the signals. And then when the train went over the bridge, the engines and 6 of the 8 cars fell into the bayou, which led to the deaths of 47 people. The other major incident involved sabotage, which happened about 2 years later, which happened outside of Harqua, Arizona. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And what happened was a length of track was unbolted and moved. Normally when a piece of track is removed, it would short circuit the signals and cause the signals to go red. And since the signals weren't tripped, the SP, because it still was the SP at this point, assumed it was sabotage, which a similar incident happened to the city of San Francisco about 60 years earlier, but I'll go over that more on the Overland route when it gets its own video. Other than that, the train was rerouted out of Phoenix when the Union Pacific took over the SP and wanted to abandon the route between Union and Phoenix. And as per usual, Amtrak in the state of Arizona didn't want to pay for the maintenance, and at least in Amtrak's case, it probably didn't have the money to keep the train in good repair and running into Phoenix proper. And as for the future of this train, other than the normal calls that I've heard from rail advocates, quote unquote, to make the train daily, there really isn't much news to be had on this route. There have been calls to restore the service east of New Orleans, and at time of writing, the Southern Rail Commission is seeking to get funds to repair the lines and start regional service at least as far as Mobile. But Florida so far is quiet on the subject of new Amtrak lines, so unless we get a new regional line between New Orleans and Mobile, there's probably not going to be any service east of New Orleans. And quite frankly, if there is, it shouldn't be considered a part of the Sunset Limited due to the poor on-time performance of the Sunset Limited back in those days. Not like it's that much better, but at least it's not. Hopefully the train's not 24 hours late on a regular basis anymore. But anyways, that's going to be the end of this one, and I will see you in the next one, which will be hopefully the Golden State. Actually, it will be. I've already recorded it. This is getting recorded asynchronously, or whatever the word should be when I'm not recording these in order. Anyways, goodbye.